What is happening to masculinity in the United States today? Why has there been such a massive decline of masculine values and the decline of masculinity and femininity at the same time in the U.S.? Today, we're going to talk about the decline of masculinity, and we have a very special guest in the studio today, my friend, the very talented, very bright James Anderson White.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
That rhymed.
Yeah,
the very talented, the very bright James Anderson White. Thank you for coming today.
Thanks for having me. And yeah, do you want to introduce the project?
Yeah, so I had been seeing some like trailers that you were putting on Instagram. Anderson and I have known each other for probably like a year and a half now.
Almost 2 years.
Almost
I think.
2 years. I think he was just born.
That's right.
Yeah. And when I saw some of the trailers you were releasing, I was really interested in this documentary that Anderson is going to release soon. When does it come out?
So it comes out Wednesday of the following week. So that's the 26th of June. And then I'll put it on Twitter, Twitter.
Yeah.
My dead naming Twitter.
Yeah.
I guess that's fitting. Yeah, I'll put that on a couple days after, I think.
Okay.
But launch on YouTube, because that's my primary platform.
Right.
On the 26th of June. And then Twitter soon after.
Yeah. So for everyone listening, it's called No Man's Land. It's a fantastic project. And I'm not just saying that because Anderson's a friend of mine. I think it's so well done. My husband and I were watching bits of it last night and just really impressed with the production quality. And even more important than that, the message. And there were so many things that you cover. It's a little lengthy. It's like 3.5 hours long.
It is lengthy. It's about 3.5 hours, which I know, it's a lot to ask maybe for people to sit down for that long. It's easy to break up into parts. It actually, in its inception, it's 4 separate videos that are already on my YouTube channel, but they've been updated and sort of renovated, re-edited. There have been additions added to it, and then there is an introduction and conclusion that sort of bookends the whole thing. But my goal was to be thorough, because as we were actually just talking about before we started going, is that there are a lot of people who want to sort of go back up a little bit of the slippery slope without realizing where these problems originated from.
Yeah.
But I think a more thorough understanding of the ideological trends sort of help us address what's going on now, because it didn't just come out of nowhere. You know, these problems are pretty deep rooted, and the goal of the project is to really get at that root, which, I mean, the root of all problems in our society is sin. You know, it's our fallen nature. But we do live in a historically unique time. We think in ways that people it would be inconceivable to think that way in times past. So that was the goal, is to survey history and kind of like I said, the trends, and sort of get at the root of these problems that we're facing today.
Yeah. And on my show, we talk pretty much exclusively about women's issues, marriage, motherhood, feminism, whatever it might be. But this is an important topic because we can't really talk about women's issues usefully unless at some point we also talk about what's happening with the men. Because as we see femininity on the decline and feminism on the rise, that of course coincides with what's happening with masculinity in our culture. And there was one part of the documentary that I really enjoyed. You talked about the first wave of feminism, because a lot of times, and this is something that I even used to say years ago. I was like, it's not feminism as a whole. The first wave wasn't so bad. Right. They kind of respected men. They didn't want women becoming men, but you gave a lot of historical context to really explain why feminism from day one, the root of feminism is depraved, it is evil, and the purpose of it at the end of the day is to cause chaos. That's and right. is to break down God's order, his perfect order that he has given us. So I loved that part of it, because I think, this documentary is about masculinity and men's issues, but it's for women too. So that's why most of my listeners are female. And I would encourage all of you to watch this, because it gives you a lot of history that even a lot of conservatives don't know.
Yeah, and like you said, it's symbiotic. Feminism tries to bifurcate, male and female, and say like women can go off and, succeed on their own. It almost pits the sexes against each other. Like what is good for men is actually bad for women. What's good for women is actually bad for men, right. Detrimental to men. But that's not at all the case. What's good for one is good for both. And what's bad for one is bad for both. And that's what we've seen with feminism, is women going off on their own without the complement, without the leadership of husbands and fathers, and it's been disastrous. And yeah, I think that's really important to point out that the sort of waves notion that there's a, first wave, second wave, third wave, and they're sort of distinct, which, as far as like when they happened, yes, they're distinct, and obviously, I would say like more recent feminism is comparably worse, but it's it's all bad. It's rotten at the core, because, like you said, it was very chaotic. There were burning churches. I think I put the headline up in the documentary that they were like going around burning churches. They were very anti-Christian, very anti-male. Like I said, pitting the sexes against each other, rebelling against God's order. And I think that's pretty vital to addressing the issue of feminism, is understanding that you can't really have God's order, patriarchal male leadership. I know that's a buzzword for some people, patriarchy, that's evil and scary, but it's not. I mean, you think of God the Father and, Christ as a man. Like, Christ could not have been incarnate as anything other than a man. He chose, his apostles were men. Obviously, there were women who came alongside who were disciples. It's cooperative, but God has ordained the leadership of men, and that's what feminism is very explicitly rebelling against.
Yes.
That's the key distinction, is that it's not, a consequence of feminism. It's the goal of feminism to rebel against that.
Yeah. And you've seen a little bit of a countercultural movement lately. I mean, even some from secular pockets of the culture, they're, saying things like, we were duped. Women weren't supposed to be in the office from 9 to 5. Being a feminist sucks. Like, I'd actually want to be home with my husband and homesteading. But I find, and you might be able to speak to this a little more too, I find that this current trad trend, because I think it's very much a trend, it's more of a fetishization of what traditional marriage is and is supposed to be. And it's
kind of the aesthetic without the commitment.
That's right. Yeah. It's like cosplay.
Yeah.
You put on the costume, you wear the sundress, you drink raw milk, you make sourdough, you frolic in the fields, you homeschool your kids, and that's all good. But what I really like about your work is that it's all centered, it's Christ-centered. And so if we really want to talk about trad and traditional and marriage, the only way to productively do so is to have Christ at the center.
Of course.
And I think that's what's really missing with the trad trend, and that's why it becomes more of a material aesthetic thing. And then it becomes, we've seen, how many girls have you seen online, the OnlyFans to trad wife pipeline? It just becomes yet another thing that they can use online.
I mean, I try
money.
not to look at women online if I can avoid it, honestly. But yeah, it's, I wouldn't say it's bad outright, because, kind of shifting the needle a little bit more towards, those traditional practices, because if it's merely a LARP, if it's just posting photos online, then obviously that's not worth anything. But if this is changing lifestyles, it's a positive. But like you said, it's kind of empty, it's kind of vapid. Even still, I could see making those lifestyle changes actually could lead people to a more substantial grounding. Once you sort of rediscover the practices of our ancestors, surely you're bound to rediscover the ideas and the faith of our ancestors. Obviously, there's this weird, bell curve, horseshoe phenomenon where you have people way over here, Christian, traditional, going about things the way that their ancestors did. And then you have all the way back around this very secular, often New Age sort of approach to it that apes that aesthetic, but is not rooted in anything. But I think we're not going to see it's not sustainable, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have the backing, the rootedness that true traditional. When we say traditional, like Christian, European, what our in America in the West our forefathers did before us. So that'll probably, I would say morph into something more true, more Christ-centered, and then everything else will probably fizzle out, because it's a trend, it's a phase. It won't stay around that long. Because if women are not, marrying a strong Christian husband, if they're not having children, taking care of them, taking care of the home, what does it matter if they're, frolicking in the field and wearing sundresses and drinking raw milk? Like, that's not going to go very far. That ends with you, actually, So I could see, like, it's probably won't last that long.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you about this too. And so I got to about the 3-hour mark. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you covered this in the last half hour. I don't think you did. But as we see a need for more masculinity, I think, like we're saying, both people of faith and people who are more secular, they both kind of see a need for masculinity, especially with the younger generation. Like a lot of Gen Z guys, I mean, we've seen so many statistics. You guys are trending more and more conservative by the day. And what do you think of the rise of like the red pill manosphere, the Andrew Tate? Because you see a lot of these young men gravitating towards these figures and towards these conversations. And in a way, of course, we can understand why, because we live in a very, very gynocentric society that rewards women for all kinds of behaviors that are degenerate. And it's much harder for men to even make it in the system. And you talked about this a lot, even the public school system, it's catered to women.
Yeah.
In your documentary, you explained how the classroom setting is just designed for girls. And that's why you see a lot of young boys really struggling in this sort of lecture style classroom. And then, of course, more women are getting college degrees and they're getting more PhDs and all that. And it's just catered to women. And so in many ways, we can understand why men are turning towards the conversation of red pill manosphere. And then the conversation about marriage, women are rewarded in the court system when it comes to divorce and custody. So what do you think of a lot of these young men turning to the red pill sort of conversations online? What's going on there?
Yeah, like you said, it's understandable. I mean, it's you can see why that's appealing to a lot of young men. I think a lot of those young men, if I had to guess, probably don't have any semblance of that in their own lives. Like, I can't really imagine someone with a really strong Christian father would be susceptible to something like this. Because I remember when Andrew Tate, for example, like first came on the scene, I was very skeptical of his messaging, because even though, it's like pro men, it's still based on those same false premises that come from feminism, that the sexes are at odds with one another. Which, I mean, in a sense, like in the reality of our modern culture, that is something that occurs. But again, it's based on those false premises. And a proper understanding is, like I said, that symbiosis. I don't want to say the sexes are complementary, but again, that has to be acknowledged within the context of God-ordained male leadership. So you can't, there are like the egalitarians who say, it's equal, they're interchangeable, whatnot. Then there's sort of the middle ground complementarian view, where it's like, no, we complement each other, we work together, but that's still missing the key controversial reality that we're complementary, but also men are designated to lead. And that's not to say that men, get off the hook. If anything, it's more of a responsibility to take care of those things. It's a higher calling. And that's what I think Andrew Tate misses, is there's no higher calling. There's no responsibility. There's no duty to anyone but yourself. It's all about, what kind of car do you drive? How many girls can you sleep with? How much money can you make? Yada, yada, yada. It's just all me. What makes me so great? And there's no understanding of like, true masculinity, which the kind of the thesis of the video, at least in that on that front, is that we have to understand masculinity within the context of virtue. You can't just divorce it from that. When leftists say like gender is a spectrum, that's not entirely incorrect, because there are men who are more masculine and men who are more effeminate. But there's a divide in the middle you can't cross. Men cannot become woman cannot become man. And also, there is, being more masculine it's more godly. Being a woman being more feminine is more godly. Like it's not an equal playing field. And I sort of animate that with the motion graphic in the video. But for the Andrew Tate types, again, it's divorced from virtue. it's just sort of this machismo aesthetic, like much like the trad wife thing. It's very shallow. It's not very rooted. And men flock to that because
it's like a caricature.
Yeah, it's a caricature. That's exactly right. And I think a lot of young men flock to that because they, the signals go off in their brain like, oh, this guy's, he's macho. The amygdala, which is the center of the brain responsible for saying no, is directly correlated with the amount of testosterone that you have.
Oh, really?
So a big amygdala, the ability to say no, I think young men see that and like, oh, he's pushing back. He's pushing back against the the gynocracy. He must be like super manly, and that's there's something to that, but it's not. It's misdirected, I think, because again, has nothing to do with responsibility. It has nothing to do with family. Nothing about like carrying on your legacy through your sons, your daughters. It's just all about consumption. And does that really fight back against the system that we're in that encourages everyone to be materialistic, to be nepotistic, to be hedonistic? Or is that just another flavor of the lies being told? And I obviously think it's the latter. Because again, based on the same false premises that the sexes are at odds with one another.
Do you see any like male influencers right now that you really like online? Any guys that stand out to you as good role models? It's tough.
Yeah, it is tough because there's a spectrum of guys. There's some guys who are like, maybe do as they say, not as they do.
Yeah.
As far as men, the unfortunate thing I think is like the really good men are men that you're going to find at your church.
And they're not chronically
your priest
online.
Or your pastor or something. They're not chronically
right.
online. But no, there are some good guys. My friend John Doyle, who you've
Love
had
John.
a couple times. I think he's good. As far as like encouraging men to. I think he gives men something more actionable to do with their lives than simply like be hyper online or, the more Andrew Tate, like just be hedonistic.
Yeah.
So, and obviously he comes at it from a Catholic, a Christian perspective.
Yeah.
So I think for young men, like that's who I would point to as really good. As far as like older than that, because, John's he's a Zoomer, I'm a Zoomer. It's sometimes like not as palatable to older people, but it's good to have older influences. It's actually more ideal.
Yeah.
But let me think.
Yeah, and you guys too, put in the comment section if there are any guys that you really like to watch online. Because I mean, I obviously I'm going to be consuming more content from like women, but it's kind of tough too because the mainstream conservative movement right now is a little bit frustrating because we were talking about this before the cameras were rolling. There's still a level of people pleasing and trying to appease both sides when it comes to the right. And Big Con, right? Con Inc., which has been identified more clearly, I think, online the last probably year or two. We've seen a lot more of the, I guess you could label it like the dissident right, call out a lot of what's been happening in the mainstream conservative movement because a lot of times these podcast hosts, commentators, whoever, they follow the money at the end of the day. And a lot of them are still using this liberal live and let live language. And you talked about this in the documentary as well when you were talking about, I use the word T-gender because if you say like trans, it's like you're almost like flagged on YouTube these days. But anyway, you see a lot of these like activists who are speaking out against T-gender stuff, but they say, I don't care if you're trans. I just don't want you infiltrating women's sports. Right. It's okay.
Or, just as long as you don't do it to the kids. But as soon as you're 18, like you can,
right.
I don't know what we're allowed to say on here, but like,
exactly.
Start chopping parts off.
Exactly. And it like they use a language like, I don't care what you do behind closed doors. And you see a lot of this stuff coming out from the right more than, and then the right is also, they get so excited when they see very liberal figures. For example, a Bill Maher, or I don't know if you've been watching Jillian Michaels come out recently.
Yeah,
she's like that big fitness woman.
Yeah, isn't she like lesbian or something?
She's a super lesbo. Yeah. She's got adopted kids, and she's probably Gen X. Terrible. But she came out recently, and her video went viral. She was doing some kind of interview talking about why she's leaving California. And then she says things like, wait till you're 18. But this whole thing about letting kids do whatever they want to their bodies, you can't even get a tattoo. At least wait till you're 18. And the right is echoing that same exact language. Yeah. And I think that's very disappointing because it just becomes this big tent philosophy. It becomes sort of like, what are we really trying to do at the end of the day? Yeah. We're putting these parameters on it. Like, it's not even objective morality. It's not objectively what's right and it's wrong. It's the liberal speak, live and let live. Yeah. And watching that unfold on the right can be a little frustrating.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's like, I don't want all this infighting on the right, but at the end of the day, there is this divide amongst conservatives of the sort of mainstream, and they believe like we need to just do whatever we can to, get Trump back in office, and we need to find a middle ground. And then there's the other part of the right that's like, we're not going to budge on these things. Yeah. It's not a live and let live philosophy.
Yeah, and I think that exactly gets to the problem and sort of my inability to give good suggestions for like who to look to is because, there are people I listen to, there are people that you can glean things from. My phrase my priest likes to use is eat the fish and spit out the bones. There's good stuff in there, but there's also like, there's caveats.
Sure.
And like, there are very few people that you can point to and sort of suggest without caveats. And the problem is that we don't have good heroes on the right. We don't. The people that we look to, like you said, are these, Hollywood liberals who they're still liberal. They're not ex-liberal or anything. They're still liberal, even like sort of leftist leaning. And they say one thing that is, and again, it's the saying no thing. It's the amygdala. It's like, oh, they said no. They pushed back just a little bit, like just a hair's breadth. And we just like invite them in all of a sudden.
They're our hero.
Ridiculous. And I think sort of the counter to that, like you said, the dissident right, they sort of, I think you see more often than like, I don't think you see many great heroes coming out of that either, people to champion, because they sort of take this, I think, embittered, burn it all to the ground approach. The reason that we're in the situation that we're in, which we talk about in the video, is that there's just been this march through the institutions. They've taken over the media. They've taken over the academia. They've changed our ideas. They've changed the very way we think, which is pretty remarkable. But that's taken time. And there are a lot of men who just want to say, like, burn it all to the ground. You just say whatever you want. Don't care about optics. Don't care about the future. But like, the future is our destiny and our families and our progeny. And again, like, going back to the family structure and carrying on that legacy, like, the best thing that most people can do, you're not going to be a talking head. You're not going to be on YouTube. It's probably better if you're not, actually, because, that makes it harder to get a job and whatnot. The people like us are kind of, that's sort of our cross to bear, is that we have all our thoughts out there on the internet for anyone to see, which makes meeting new people super difficult. I don't know if you've come across that, but you're like,
sometimes
what do you
moms.
do?
Yeah. Like, there was a mom in our neighborhood, and we probably met her last year. She's got 3 kids, and our kids play a lot. But like, probably 2 months after we met, she texted me. She was like, I found your page and I love it. But it's always like, you don't really know if it's going to go one way or the other. But
yeah. And it's like, I mean, just there's never been a time in history, I guess, unless you were like a published author for a long time, where someone could just instantly meet you and like know all your opinions on everything. Yeah. Which again, it's our cross to bear. I think, I do it because I think that, I think I sort of have a pretty good perspective on things, because it's not because it's me, because it's centered in Christ, and we don't have that in a lot of areas, but still, it's, anyway, enough about us. But yeah, we need better heroes. We need better people to look to in the present and in the past. And our litmus for that needs to be Christ. And we can't have good heroes if they're not Christ-like. Yeah. And, we need to, I think, be a little more critical about that, because, some liberal who decides to say, like, like we said, you could be trans when you're 18, but not before that. It's just, I don't know. It's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, even like the Dave Rubin types.
Yeah. Like, I mean, this is Dave Rubin, for example, is a guy who he may say good things, like he may be good on certain issues, but at the end of the day, he's married to another. Well, it's not marriage, it's a mirage.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
He's living with another man.
They bought 2 children.
They purchased 2 children to basically create this, white picket fence facade of like, we're a little family. It's like, you're not a family. I talk about this in the video as well, is that this idea that 2 gay men or 2 lesbian women could go off and have a family, white picket fence in the suburbs and have kids. That's homosexuality, sodomy, I think is more accurate of a term. It's been around, Sodom and Gomorrah, its namesake, that was over 5,000 years ago. But it has only been until recently that this idea that they can go be a family, or that could be like, again, it just apes the aesthetic of like conservative household. It's not conservative. There's nothing about that that's conservative. What are you're conserving nothing. Mm-hmm. But yeah,
and it was frustrating whenever they announced we purchased the kids,
celebrated,
and a lot of the right was like, "This is amazing, congratulations!" And then those same people on the right would turn around and share videos of surrogacy and talk about how horrible it is.
Yeah, and those children they're like you said, they've been purchased, and they're to validate this sexual deviancy, and they're being deprived of a mother, and that's inherently abusive. I share like stats. Because the domestic abuse stats, like as far as like physical, are very high in gay and lesbian households. But what people don't realize is that regardless of those stats, you could say like, well, it's not every kid. In a way it is. Like every child who grows up in a household like that, maybe they're not beaten. Most of them are, but even if they're not, they're being psychologically abused. Being in that situation, like growing up without one of their parents, and worse than that, because there are a lot of kids who grew up without a parent, but even worse than that, like with 2 of the same, and the dysfunction that comes with that.
Yes.
Because as we've been saying, there's a symbiosis between men and women. That's the way that God has designed the household, is you have this balance. And so when you have 2 men together, they're highly promiscuous because their sex drives are really high. They're not very faithful to one another. Like I said, promiscuity is very high. And then women are seeking safety, so they seek that in one another, but they can't find that in. They're trying to find what they could only find in a man in another woman, and so they move in together very quickly. That's not even conjecture really. That's kind of a stereotype in the lesbian community.
Yeah,
is jokes about like moving in together very quickly and then moving out very quickly.
Yes,
because they beat the crap out of each other. They're trying to find safety and security. And then they feel sort of betrayed by a person who just cannot give that to them. So subjecting a child to that kind of household that's inherently dysfunctional, like having 2 men who are just like sex addicts and like 2 women, like I said, who are just beating the crap out of each other and probably beating the crap out of you, is just absurd.
Yeah.
And evil. It's evil. Yeah. And, I understand like you mentioned the sort of big tent approach, but if we can't conserve these things, we can't conserve anything.
Yeah.
And like I said, again, the family is destiny. My politics are very simple. I want to ensure the protection and progeneration and prosperity of American Christian families, and like that we have to have something as the right to unite around. And I can't think of anything better than that. It's like we want families to be able to exist without being replaced, being preyed upon by people that are coming from all over the world who are, murdering and raping American children and American people. And, we want them to be able to practice Christianity, the faith of our fathers. And we want them to be able to be like safe and prosperous. Mm-hmm. And if our government, if our society, if our culture cannot prioritize that, if it cannot ensure that, then we're not a country. at all.
I think that's really powerful. I love that. My politics are really simple.
Yeah.
It's really about the American Christian family. And you can actually branch off from there and talk about a lot of legislation based on the family unit, even down to mass immigration.
Right.
Mass immigration is harmful to the family unit. It's harmful to the middle class and men finding jobs and being pushed out of jobs and the wage lowering because of mass immigration. There's so many things that affect the family unit.
Yeah.
And then you can talk even about like tax breaks. And I mean, even Poland, for example, right? They have, if you have 4 or more children under a certain age, you don't pay income tax. So
yeah,
even
you have
like,
these countries that like incentivize this,
Yes.
where it seems like everything in our country disincentivizes
Exactly.
that, unless you're like, you know, a single black mom and like you get more welfare checks the more children you have.
Yeah.
We're not incentivizing.
We're incentivizing the opposite.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to look at it. That's why whenever I talk about anything on my channel, I always try to ask myself, this women's issue, I want to speak about it in a way that's building healthy, whole women for strong families, for a thriving society.
Right.
Like that's the whole purpose.
Yeah, and the point of like my documentary is like, where have men gone? It's not just so that men can, I don't know, feel good about themselves. It's so that they can go out and lead a family. And what people don't understand is like, you know, even though we see marriage on decline, like historically that's sort of like the bare minimum. Like it's not, I wouldn't say it's exactly simple necessarily, but it's very easy for most people eventually to like get married and have kids.
Right.
It's very, you'd have to be like exceptionally challenged in some area to like not accomplish that. And like I said, it's a bare minimum, but to do that right,
yes,
and by doing it right, to preserve your marriage, like to remain married, you know, divorce rates are just through the roof, to remain married and then to have kids who you raise in the fear and admonition of the Lord, who are Christian, like by the time that they come to their adulthood, ideally for the rest of their lives, and who's like, you know, for your daughters, like protect their purity, for your sons, like protect their integrity, raise them up to be fathers, raise your daughters up to be mothers.
Yeah.
How many people do that? Like,
Very
can you think of a lot of people who do those things? And like, that's a very small list of requirements, but historically, like that was just the standard. And it's very difficult to think of like how many families, remain married and raise their kids in a Christian household in order for them to also raise Christian households and keep that cycle going. It's a very small number. And so to say like, you know, trad aesthetics aside, like, you know, getting married and having kids, that's great, but like, are you going to do it right? So that's my whole goal for men, is to say like, you know, you got to hold the line here. And for women, I think it's like, I say this in video, but I think women don't really know their place in society and their role in a marriage. And men, I think, sort of get that innately. Like, you know, I protect, I provide. The problem with men is apathy, like just sort of shirking that responsibility, saying like, I'm just going to sit in the basement in my little man cave, you know, isolated in my own house, relegated to like the couch and the TV and, you know, watch football and eat like seed oil chips, like cheese puffs or whatever all day. Man, it's more like apathy. It's more like, you know what you need to do, but you're not doing it. Women, I think, just simply do not understand what's to be asked of them.
It's like the rebellion that is at the women's core, I think, is to rebel against what our nature is and what our role is.
Yeah. But if you look at, you know, people of the past, the women of the past and what they would do for their family, it's remarkable. It's so, like, we got to laud that capability, like to be able to cook and clean and make clothes, like make a home out of a house. Like that's such an incredible thing. And that produces great people. Like every great man ever, you know, probably had like a mom who enabled, I mean, obviously he had to be born in the first place. But more than likely, like he had a strong household to grow up in, unless he had some other adversity that he had to overcome. But even still, women, I think, are dissuaded from the satisfaction that's found in being that comforter and building that household to raise up strong boys. They're told you go out and be the boss babe and climb the corporate ladder. But like you said, I think at the end of the day find that very unfulfilling. But when we look back at what women did traditionally, we see a much more fulfilling way to go about life maybe it's not you who's like the superstar, but like, what if you raise five, five young men who go out and change the world? Like, mathematically, like just 1 versus 5, obviously that's
and plus,
no question.
Honestly, giving birth, you feel like a superstar.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Well, of course. I mean, like again, it ought to be championed, but it's not.
Yeah, it's a very tremendous responsibility. And, after, the birthing experience is, like I said, tremendous. But I think the amazing responsibility and fulfillment that comes from that, the feminist side will be upset at the weight of that responsibility. But I think a lot of women who can really, if you can lean into it and really recognize God's order in it, that's why I always say, I just don't know how a woman can go through pregnancy and birth and not believe in God. I don't know how you can go through that experience and be atheist or even agnostic. I don't know how. Yeah. It is such a perfectly made miracle. Feeling your child grow inside of you, and then the birthing experience, and then holding that child. It's like, I don't know how you could possibly go through that without faith. And even if you grow up atheist or agnostic, whatever, I don't know how you can go through that experience and not feel like you want to seek the source of that. Yeah. But I really like what you said earlier about how it's the bare minimum to tell people to get married and have kids. I actually have an episode coming up recently because I've been doing a lot of thinking about the right, talking about outbreeding the left. They say, get married as young as possible. That's a cry that comes from a lot of conservatives lately. Charlie Kirk and Benny Johnson sort of went viral a few months ago for telling all the kids at the conference, like, get married as young as you can. And I don't think there's anything wrong with getting married young, obviously, if you find the right person. It's a good start, but I think it's lacking because you're right. We should not just be getting married for the sake of getting married and sticking it to the left. We really need to be preparing young men and women for what marriage is, how to choose a spouse wisely, because the most important thing is that you stay married and you build a very stable home for your children. And I think that's a really big piece that's missing, because it sometimes feels like they just want to commodify marriage and parenthood just to make the left mad. Like there was this sort of viral thing where libs of TikTok shared a screen grab of an article that said they're trying to outbreed the left, and she was like, we're going to outbreed the left, cry more libs. And I'm like, well, you really want to just have kids to make the libs mad? That's not the reason why we should be having kids. We should be teaching young people how to prepare themselves for wifehood and to be husbands, and how to prepare them to have children and bring children into the world, because that's really, not only is it the most important thing, that's the hardest thing. It's easy to get married. It's actually pretty easy to walk down the aisle and find somebody that you love. Because especially when it's a new relationship, like you can imagine spending forever with them. But once you're married, you get through the first few years and you get through that first child.
Yeah. That's you don't have that foundation.
Yeah. That romance is it's going to fade. So I think we need to prepare young people for something much bigger. It's like, because like you said, getting married is the bare minimum.
Yeah. And like I said, this concept of outbreeding the left, it's a good start. Like it's a good slogan, but how do we know that we're outbreeding the left and not breeding like cannon fodder for the left? Yeah. And like I said, think about how many people successfully conduct a family. And again, that's like raising your children in order so that they can raise Christian children. Very few people do that. And so if we're like, go out and get married and have as many kids as possible. If you have all those kids and, they go into the college system and come out like, unpure and blue-haired and whatever, like, what has that done for us? Yeah. We've just, again, like just given them, thrown them in the meat grinder. So I think, like you said, preparation is so important. I think a lot of, I see this from young men. I think it's similar with young women, but you have single, unmarried men who are just like pining away, like, I want to woe is me. I want to get married. No girlfriend, feel bad for me online. But the season of, prior to marriage should be the preparation for marriage. Like if you're not married, if you don't have a girlfriend, You have all this time
Yeah.
that God could be using to, if you let him, to make you the best man that you can be. And that's not to say that that's in perpetuity. I don't think you should hesitate to get married, but you should be adequately prepared, at least in understanding what marriage should be. Because when you get married, like the great thing about marriage is that you learn together, you grow together. You're not going to know everything day one, so you shouldn't put it off for the sake of like, oh, I just have to figure out all the tips and tricks. Like, you're not going to learn that until you do it. So, there should be preparedness. There shouldn't be hesitation. But we have to sort of get our definitions, our priorities in order. Understanding actually what marriage is, being a covenant before God for life, and everything that entails, like who God is as our Father, who he's called us to be as men and women. And that's something I try and stress in the documentary, is that a man being masculine, a woman being feminine, that's not like a salvation issue, but it is a sanctification issue. Because a man, like, to be Christ-like is to obey, the design that he's given for you in creating you as a man. And there is I think we sort of pre-assume this, but it's good, I think, for the audience to say, like, there is an objective reality, like certain behavioral traits are more masculine or less masculine. Same, with women, more feminine, less feminine. That's very objective. People want to treat that like it's just, whatever. It's a societal construct or whatever. That's not true at all. Again, tying it to virtue, it's more about virtue, less of an aesthetic. The aesthetic ought to be a result of the virtue. That ought to be the visual fruit.
Yeah.
Because I think, men and women ought to look a certain way, but just to pursue the look and not what ought to be generating our desire to look and behave a certain way is misguided. But again, like young men and women, if they're not married, they need to be preparing for marriage. Most parents don't do this, but if you still, if you have kids in the home, like, you ought to be preparing, you ought to be modeling in your marriage what that should look like. You should be having these conversations with them, preparing for the reality of marriage, because again, we need vigilance. We don't understand how harsh the world is and how much how the world is working overtime to subvert the family. They're counting on men to be ineffective and women to be subversive. They're banking on that. In the documentary, I have this sort of like alternate reality, sort of dystopian future premise, and like, I don't think that's exactly possible, because obviously the gates of hell will not prevail over the church. Like, God's not going to let that happen, but I don't think it's entirely impossible that we don't get pretty close to our ideas of gender just being gone and everyone lives in pods and just consumes, like everyone's just a consumer. So we have to guard against that, and we have to acknowledge, like, that future, even if it's not like a possibility to that extent, that's what they want. That's what the left, that's their, that's the reality that they're seeking to build, and they're banking on, like I said, they're banking on our ineffectiveness. They're banking on women being subversive. And so we have to guard against that with everything that we have. There are wolves right outside, our camp. And if we don't have the men especially taking charge, like setting watches, then we're going to get eaten alive. And I think a lot of that has to do with the college system. College is, I'm not this, you mentioned Charlie Kirk earlier. I like Charlie Kirk, and I think he's gotten a lot better on the issues over the last few years.
He has gotten better on some stuff.
I respect that. It's really important to say, like, there's a better way to look at this than I did before. I think part of that is because he's gotten married, which, good on him. Like I said, that
becoming a dad,
that really helps a lot.
Yep.
But one of his shticks is kind of this, like, college is a scam thing. And it is for a lot of people. But like we were talking about earlier, not everyone's going to be a talking head. We need young men to be going to college, to be getting a degree. Say what you will about credentialism. Is it kind of stupid? Yeah, but like, that's kind of how the system works. We sort of have to play the game to a certain extent. There's a way to do that without compromising on our values. There's, you see the Con Inc. The Con Inc. thing is like, just compromise, make friends with our enemies. And then the opposite of that is like this burn it all to the ground. Mm-hmm. Don't compromise, but like, there's no effectiveness in that. Mm-hmm. So I think there's more of a middle road. Like, we can send young men to college to get, become lawyers, become engineers, become politicians. Despite the influences in our government, like obviously there are nefarious influences, just don't be influenced by them, But like, if we can get our guys near the levers of power, we can actually start to make a change on a broader scale, but then on a smaller scale, like in individual lives, like going to church, starting a family, understanding family, doing that correctly. Kind of rambling at this point, but the point being is that the college system, especially for young women, there's no conception, I talk about this in the video, but there's no conception historically that a woman at any point in her life should be on her own. She's under the headship and leadership of a father who protects her, physically, but also like her purity. And that is a good and godly thing.
Yeah.
To take her out from under, and historically, you would go from the leadership and the headship of a father to the leadership and the headship of a husband. And, obviously there are men who don't do that right. They're abusive or they fall short in some certain way. That doesn't mean that system is bad, because when we look at scripture, that system is God ordained. Just because we in our sin fall short doesn't mean that we should throw that out altogether. But we've sort of replaced the marriage, when a woman is of age, she gets married off to a man who is going to love her and take care of her. We've sort of replaced that with college, and this is not a unique point. I saw this on Twitter. I don't remember who from, but he was making this comparison that these college signing ceremonies are sort of this replacement ritual for marriage. Like, you have the fathers present to go sign their daughters off to not one loving man who's going to provide for her, but frankly, a lot of men who are just going to see her as a piece of meat in the college system. And then, the academia who's going to influence her against basically everything that she's been brought up with. And women are, a little bit more susceptible to being influenced poorly. People don't want to admit that, I don't think. And obviously men can be deceived. We're not saying that men can't. But, it goes back to the garden. Like, who did the serpent decide to pick on with who did the serpent decide to entice with the forbidden fruit? It wasn't Adam, it was Eve. And sending women off to college, there's a difference between going to college, like locally, and being sent off. I'm not saying that women should never go. Yeah, I'm not saying that women should never go to college at all. But being sent away, you're basically forfeiting that duty of responsibility. And I think there are very few cases. You may be able to point to exceptions where that didn't go wrong, but I think in almost every case, in an overwhelming number of cases, you see women who become more liberal, who probably lose their virginity if they hadn't already, and they're not set up. They don't have that foundation for doing family correctly, doing it well, and that's a disaster. Like if we can't point to that and say, like, maybe we should rethink this, maybe we should prioritize marriage, preparation for marriage, over, college is ultimately, like, in order to get a job, in order to have a career. Like, men should be the ones having careers, not women, because men are designed to be the breadwinners, to be the leaders. Women are designed to be at home, and that's not to say that women can't work. You work from home and do great work from home, and but everything's
within the context of the home, and that's
right, and it's for the service of the home.
Right.
But a career, when a woman is outside the home, it is at the expense of the home.
And that's what you made that distinction in the documentary too. Yeah. It has to be for the home, not at the expense of the home.
Because with all our modern conveniences, we fail to acknowledge how needy children are, and someone is going to meet those needs. It's either going to be you, or it's going to be someone who cares significantly less for the well-being of your child.
Exactly.
So if you don't cook, like, yeah, you can go get it at a restaurant or fast food. They're using as cheap and crappy ingredients as possible. And we could spend so much time talking about that alone. But like, baby formula, for an example, you can either breastfeed your child or you can feed them formula, which is like soy solids that have 2,000 times the amount of estrogen that breast milk has. It's this synthetic alternative because it's cheap. And the person making the baby formula doesn't care about your baby. You care about your baby. And so, you could just go down the line with like, all these environmental factors in the home, the clothes that you wear, like, you can outsource that to someone else, but they're not going to care. They're not going to have your well-being in mind, your children's well-being in mind, and it's probably going to be to their detriment. So
even down to the emotional wellness and the emotional attachment of the child.
Course.
You can't, the thing about the connection and the emotional attachment to the mom is that's something that you cannot outsource. Even if you attempt to.
Yeah, and you talk about daycare a lot. That's like a prime example. It's like you can have someone else take care of your children, but like even developmentally, that's just setting them up for so much trouble.
Even down to a child being held and your baby looking into your eyes and seeing mommy's face and responding to mommy's smiles and facial expressions, like that is, it's just a completely different thing when it's a stranger, and that can't be replicated.
Right.
No matter how much you want it to, you can't outsource that. And I think that's something that a lot of moms are starting to realize. I see so many moms now on TikTok that come out and they're like, I feel like I was duped. I have to drop my kids off at daycare every day and I hate it. It makes me hurt inside. I'm like, because it is being separated in that way is unnatural. I think a lot of women are really starting to realize that.
Yeah. And that's, when it comes to these issues, obviously, I think it's, even though it's not necessarily men's fault, it is a responsibility in every case. So when you have these women who are like, oh, I was duped, that's because they did not at some point have a father or husband to tell them this was not a good idea. And, back to like the con Inc., like wanting to get good boy points with people that hate us, men sort of have this, default setting, at least in our society nowadays. It's like, your masculinity is toxic. Like to say anything against the system is like, that's bad. And that's reinforced over and over again through movies and TV and whatnot. It's just reinforced that like you being a man is toxic and bad. And, like just look at, again, TV. What are the fathers that we see portrayed in TV? It's like, Homer Simpson. It's not, when was the last time you saw a strong masculine father in a TV show?
Like someone like Phil Dunphy from Modern Family. He's just like a total goofball that always gets everything wrong.
You get everything wrong. You're the butt of every joke.
Yes.
You're not to be taken seriously.
Right.
Oh, Dad, he's what a goofy guy. Like I would never take advice from that guy.
I can't leave the kids with him. He's gonna end up killing them. Like it's,
There's no sense of like wisdom, of leadership, of respect. That's just totally absent. And so men need to step up with the willingness to say to women, hey, this is not a good idea. And that's a lot to ask. And it's a lot to ask for women to trust that, but it's very necessary. And men are the only ones who can do that. Like, as much as it's so important for women to teach other women, we see that modeled in Titus 2. Paul exhorts the older women to teach the younger women. That's so important.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, if you just have that, if you just say like, come on, girls, let's get it together, it's not going to do anything unless you have a woman has a man in her life who is wise, who is looking to something greater than himself, because we're fallen and sinful, and sometimes we make terrible leaders, but we have to acknowledge something greater than ourselves, or we're just going to succumb to our own shortcomings. But unless they have someone in their life, first a father, then a husband, to say like, this is how we're going to do things, and I'm not throwing you to the wolves like everyone else in your life has wanted to. That's really the only way we can start healing and repairing the damages done by the propaganda.
Yeah, I think one important piece to preparing young people for marriage, in addition to this, obviously, leadership of the father, is to be in a strong community and a high trust village, which ideally, of course, is the Christian community.
Yeah.
Church life has declined so much over the last 100 years. I mean, it's like, because our ancestors, the high trust villages were most of the time bonded by religious values, amongst other things like blood and ethnicity and tradition, things like that. But
well, those things are downstream from the religion.
Exactly. They're all downstream. So I think that when I talk to young women about preparing for marriage, if you are a single woman, because oftentimes the woman is the social heart of the home. The woman is going to usually be the one that connects the children and the family with other families and with other children. And it's very important for women to know how to foster community and how to especially foster community for your kids. And so to be part of a strong Christian community before you get married, that in and of itself is going to be, that's like a first line of defense for yourself and your family too. And the stronger family and the stronger community that you're in is going to be a great defense against the world around you, whether that is the mainstream culture or whatever the media is trying to sell to kids, the university life, academia, whatever it might be. It's very important for young people to be part of a strong community. I think that's lacking. Okay, we got to wrap in about a couple minutes, but I want to leave it to you if there's anything lastly that you want to finish with, anything about the documentary that you wanted to share, and then also tell people where to find you.
Yeah, sure. I'll say to your point, and to mine before that, we hear like open-mindedness sort of thrown around by leftists, like be open-minded, and often that means just like be so open-minded that your brains fall out, and but there is a certain openness that I think people need to have to not like these new liberal ideas, but ideas of the past. We sort of have this chronological superiority complex that what's now is best, but I don't think you can really honestly say that about anything that we do, really. I think we have a lot to learn from the people that came before us, and in a very immediate way with like grandparents, but especially like with people of the past that we find through old books, old texts, but especially through scripture, which is timeless. And I think we need a certain openness to reframing and reorienting ourselves and making sure every area of our life is oriented towards Christ, especially in who we are as men and women, because otherwise the family is just going to continue to crumble. And, men especially need to take up that mantle because it's ours to take up. No one else is going to do it. And it's up to men to take that stand and to be, some semblance of the men that came before us. And sometimes that's like, that suggestion is hard to hear, but it's natural and it's good. And I think like once you sort of get over the initial discomfort that's like programmed into you, again, from like all the propaganda, the movies and TV, the academia, it's very fulfilling. It's very freeing. Women, I think, their initial like resistance is like, don't tell me what to do. But then they like start getting told what to do, and they actually really like it.
Women
and that
deep down love being told what to do.
And that may be like, oh, that's really shocking. But it's like, what was in I think it was maybe like the 1970s or 80s when they removed all the wolves out of Yellowstone, and like the elk population got so egregious that they had to reintroduce them. Like it may feel like we're reintroducing wolves into the ecosystem, but that's actually a good thing because the balance is off. So what's good and natural and godly may be shocking, it may be a little off-putting, but have a little bit of an open mind about it, and not an open mind like in a sense that you're just unperceptive, uncritical. Again, anything that I say, I say things that are wrong all the time. Like check it with scripture. I'm still learning. I'm still obviously very young. I don't think that that's necessarily a disqualifier, because Paul exhorts Timothy, like, don't let them say that you're disqualified because you're young. I think I'm standing on something much greater than myself. And, I think people just need to have a little open mind about it, seek the scriptures, pray about it, learn from older people. But it's really important that we hold the line on the family. There are other political issues that matter, of course, but if our families crumble, then none of that matters. The economy doesn't matter. Foreign relations don't matter if our families are being subverted. And there's a lot of things that connect to that, like we were talking about immigration. I don't touch on that in the documentary so much, but it's a very integral to that issue. But as far as I'll say in the documentary, it's should be out very soon after this episode goes out, unless you want to wait to release it on the same day. But yeah, it's called No Man's Land: The Downfall of American Masculinity. It tracks, it starts with the transgenderism and sort of traces that back through sexual deviancy, the normalization of sodomy, gay and lesbian stuff, and then before that feminism, and then before that industrial secularism. Secularism being the removal of God from our society, industrialism being sort of the artificial apparatus that makes those things possible, and then concluding with an exhortation of how we can do better going forward. So it's lengthy, but I think it'll be worth anyone's time.
Worth it.
And again, to consider prayerfully, scripturally. But thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah. I wish we could go for longer. I mean, we could go for 2 hours, but I just got to feed the baby, but we could go. You're always welcome back anytime.
Yeah.
Because you're not too far away.
No, not at all.
Yeah. But I'd love to have you. I know I've been telling my listeners I want to have guests on, but it's just, as I was telling you, it's tough to find the pockets of time because I usually film when the kids are asleep.
Yeah.
And it's hard to, match that up with a guest. But when it's a friend, it's easy to kind of be more flexible.
Yeah.
But everybody, if you don't know Anderson's work, please follow him. He's just
James Anderson White on YouTube, on Instagram and Twitter. I think if you type that, my handles are all different, but I think if you type that in, you'll find it.
Same. My handles
pretty easily.
Yeah, I think the name is just going to bring them to you.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for coming. Thanks everyone for listening. Don't forget to like the video. Please subscribe to the channel. Turn on the post notifications. You know how to do all the things. And please don't forget to support the show by clicking on the links for our sponsors. And we'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.